Welcome. If you need some support, check out my free IFS guided meditations at faithfullygrowing.com. Additionally, if you're finding this podcast helpful, consider making a tax-deductible gift to keep IFS accessible to all. And you can do that at faithfullygrowing.com/donate. Welcome back to IFS Meditations and Insights. I'm Tim Fortescue, here to help foster wholeness and healing through an internal family systems lens. In this caring space, we aim to dive into self-discovery and inner knowledge. I truly believe that when we accept all parts of ourselves, we're able to experience deep love and live more fully. I'm thankful to be part of your path to inner peace and sacred connection. So settle in, open up your heart and mind, and let's begin another episode. In this special bonus episode, I have a conversation with Stephanie Mitchell. Stephanie is a level 3 trained IFS therapist working in private practice on the Sunshine Coast of Australia. And she offers training, group therapy, consultation using the IFS model. Stephanie specializes in working with complex trauma and is experienced with working with individuals that get diagnosed as quote unquote having mental illness. Stephanie is interested in how healing and change occur in the human-to-human relationship within spaces of safety and acceptance and outside the constructs of diagnostic labels. Stephanie offers some great insight, and so let's jump in to the conversation. Well, Stephanie, I appreciate you reaching out and that I can have the opportunity to have you on the podcast. As I had mentioned, this is the first time that I've done something like this, but I hope it's something that I can continue doing, is getting expertise from folks like you. And just want to let listeners know too that we're recording where it's evening where I am. So my household, 4 kids and a dog and whatnot, are a little more active than they normally are during the day. So if there's a bark in the background or something, we're just going to roll on through with that. But yeah, just grateful for you're here and would love to just hear more about you and whatever you want to share there.
Sure. Yeah. It's a great question. What do I want to share? I think for me, what I want to share initially is just how much IFS has really transformed my life. I've had some pretty significant trauma, but also then significant difficulties in my adult life. And so finding IFS and finding a way of being with my parts and being with my experience so that my system was less afraid of what was going on. And then eventually, obviously, the healing that comes where I'm much more connected with my parts than ever, whereas I think I used to dissociate a lot. That's probably the main important thing about me. It's really made a big difference in my life, the IFS work.
Yeah, and really is similar to me, just the healing that I found in the model. And yeah, just so excited to continue my own work and grow and to share that with others. And how'd you first get involved with IFS? How long has it been? Would love to hear more of your story in that.
Well, I'm an IFS therapist and, I'm a therapist in private practice. And I was working at the time as a trauma therapist, but I was just really finding that the skills that I was using were not really making me very happy. My clients felt cared for, but I didn't feel that they were really getting enough resolution to all their suffering. And then someone had suggested that I try some IFS therapy training. And when I started to look into that, I thought, wow, I need this for me. And so I started having my own therapy in IFS. And I've had now many, many, many sessions, years and years of IFS work. And so that's how I got into it initially. And what I found was, well, what was my favorite thing, I suppose, is that no one tried to ground me. No one told me my feelings or my big experiences weren't welcome. Everything was taken with curiosity, and this is understandable. And, my dysregulation there was no attempt to regulate me. Regulation happened through the co-regulation with my IFS practitioner and the acceptance and getting to know parts. I naturally just was able to regulate. And so, so I learned about it by being a client, I suppose. And then I went and did my level 1.
Okay. And you had said level 3 is what is your experience with training and whatnot?
Yeah. So I did my level 1 in Australia, and then I did and that was with Mary Kruger, and level 2 was in Vietnam, actually. We're very lucky to, Southeast Asia is so close to us in Australia. So we flew up there, and I did my level 2 with Frank Anderson, who is an amazing human being. And then I was lucky enough to do my level 3 with Dick Schwartz in Italy, actually. There was 10 of us who flew from Australia to Italy, so that we could kind of build some sense of community together. There's not as much community in Australia as in the US. We're a fledgling little community here, so it felt like a really nice place to connect. So I've done the level 3, and then I've just done lots of other things. I went back and did level 2 IFIO with Tony Herbine Blank, and she is incredible. She's like a really gifted teacher, as well as something embodied, there's something about the way that Tony thinks about relationships and how we be with people that I really enjoyed in her training. So I've done that. And then I've just done a lot of things. I've done a fair few retreats with Dick Schwartz. I went and did Shame Camp with Tony Herbine Blank last year in September, which was an incredible experience, working with shame and shaming parts of me who hold shame, shaming parts who shame the exiles. Yeah, it was really beautiful. So I'm pretty, deep in the model. I joke that I've drunk the Kool-Aid.
Yeah, I get it. And just it's so life-changing. And so, yeah, for me, and then when I experience that with others. And I'm looking forward to getting into the meat of your work in just a bit, because I'm very curious about that. Any other mentors, colleagues, or how kind of IFS has influenced your practice?
Michelle Glass is a significant mentor of mine. Her daily parts meditation practice, when I finally took that on board, it took me a long time. My parts were not interested in it. But about 5 years into my therapy with an IFS practitioner, my parts were ready to do that. And so I now have a daily practice. So Michelle Glass is, the way she embodies her self-energy, she's a significant mentor of mine. Pam Krause, I've done a few of her courses, and there's something about the way Pam speaks about, one of the things that Pam said in IFS talks, but I've also been in training with her on her self-like parts training with Life Architect, where she says, the more we heal, the more we hear from our parts. We don't become sort of like just full of self-energy and never hear from our parts. We're actually always in relationship. And that's what I find. I find that I'll be out somewhere, and whether I'm feeling playful and can blend with a playful part, and I know which part it is, and I can let myself go there, or whether I can be blended with a scared part, or a part who's just like, the other day I was walking in my car after seeing a friend, and I felt very dysregulated. And I thought, what's going on? Like, I don't know why I feel so unsettled. And my initial thought was, I didn't get enough time in the conversation for me. I was just like focused on their needs. And then I went, let's just I want to hear what's really going on. And so I said, who's upset inside, right? And what I actually heard was that I really wanted my friend to solve my problem that I'd come with. So it wasn't the amount of time. It wasn't the amount of time, actually, which was what obviously some manager or some part of me had thought. It was a little exile who was kind of wanting somebody external to solve a problem for me. And that's a really core experience from my childhood too. I was very alone, there's a lot of neglect. So this early wounding around somebody external is going to be the person who does it, right? That level, so that what I'm trying to come back to is that level of mindfulness that I have now, that level of really being able to not just go, I wonder what happened, I'm just going to ground myself because I feel unsettled. No, that's kind of like avoiding my parts. I don't want to ground myself. I want to go, what's happening, guys? And really get to hear, and then I can go, oh, yeah, of course you wanted an answer and you want someone to fix it. And it's okay because I'm here and we're going to eventually get through the problem. I'm selling my house. And so they were worried about the sale of the house and they wanted to talk with my friend about it. And yeah, so yeah.
Well, it's just beautiful to, yeah, you can have, yeah, there's still the grounding and the mindfulness, but there's more of a context. And yeah, that conversation that we can have with our internal world is so healing, for sure. Let me ask you one more kind of general question, and then we can kind of jump in a little more. But I am curious because a lot of people who listen to the podcast, some are new to IFS, some may have just first heard of it, some are practitioners and people who are very experienced. But how do you explain IFS to someone maybe for the first time or that they've heard?
Yeah. The way that I explain it initially is really that you are going to get to know yourself better than you have ever understood yourself in the past. That you are just going to listen inside in a way that helps you to understand why you're stuck in the stuck places you are, and why you beat yourself up, or why you criticize others, or the things that you really don't know about yourself, I suppose, are just going to become easy to know. So that's how I explain it initially. And then obviously there's the minutiae of what does that actually look like in practice, which is a whole other thing.
And there's just the jumping in and like those thinking parts or trying to understand. And if we can just pause and trust the process, it's just, yeah, it's amazing what happens there for sure. Well, tell us a little more about like your specialty, your passion, what you do the most. And then on top of that, too, if there are other modalities like that you've practiced in the past that maybe you see differently now, or
Okay.
modalities that you
Yeah.
still
So
kind
my
of incorporate in.
specialties and my passions um, are, it's interesting. Let me slow down and think about this. I have three specialties basically. Early developmental trauma and attachment wounding is my passion. And that's, I suppose, because I've done so much healing in my own internal world from my own significant attachment wounding and neglect. So when I'm sitting with someone who has that, it's a very intimate experience, right? So I feel very connected to that kind of work. And I've done a lot of reading. Another, like if I think of a non-IFS mentor of mine, Patricia Deyoung, who wrote the book Understanding and Treating Chronic Shame, she is an incredible, that book, that in Understanding and Treating Chronic Shame, helps us to understand our parts a bit better from the perspective of why we use projection and transference onto therapists, why we, I don't even know how to explain it actually. Yeah, just the shaming parts of ourselves, that shame ourselves as a protective function or shame others. She kind of expands on it more than a lot of the IFS stuff does.
Okay, but yeah, the shame is so, yeah, so big. The vulnerability in general,
Exactly.
and then yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So I love that work. That's probably my biggest passion. I also do specialize, and this came about because of just where I ended up having my first role as a counselor. So when I first finished my training as a therapist, I moved into an organization that was previously called the Schizophrenia Council of South Australia. And now then the name changed to Mental Illness Fellowship of South Australia. And now it's called Skylight Mental Health. But when I first started with them, they had this history of working with people who were diagnosed with schizophrenia. And so my first counseling role had a lot of people coming either with a diagnosis of schizophrenia or a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. And I don't adhere to labels. I don't adhere to diagnostic categories. I think the DSM is problematic. But, just broadly, how do I speak about what my work is? It's kind of hard to not use labels. So, yeah, that's how I came to work in that space. I had my very first client was someone who'd been in DBT a lot, lots of early developmental trauma, including sexual abuse. And, what I learned from that job, because I had exceptional supervision, what I learned was really that being with the client with self-energy is what IFS would call it, right? Curiosity, openness, I'm not afraid of you. And that first person was, really struggling with a lot of not only self-harm, but self-mutilation and doing things to make the wound infected and, really a lot of self-hatred in her system. And the supervision I got, plus the freedom to just be from self-energy with a client, really allowed me to just settle into my role as a therapist and know that I don't have to change anyone. There's no special sort of tools or skills that I need in order to help someone. Because that woman, I was very Rogerian back then. I still am. And that particular lady, after 4 months of just kind of this deep listening, she just stopped self-harming after 30 years in the health service, in and out of hospital and things. So, yeah, so that was my introduction, is how I got into working with those two populations of people, which is really all trauma.
Well, I know so my background is I'm level 2 trained, but I'm a practitioner. I don't have a mental health training. I have more of a seminary pastoral type training and background that I come from. But my wife, she is a licensed clinical social worker and has been practicing for 20 years or so. And I mentioned to her about the interview with you, and I know she was amazed that, not that people would specialize in this, but it's challenging. It's needed, and but it's challenging. And I'm curious, just what unique challenges that you have had in applying IFS. And I am thinking in my own work, just a lot of people, like those numbing parts or dissociating parts, they don't realize that those are even parts, and it's such a big part of the process. So tell me more about that, if you'd like.
Sure. So essentially, how I view psychosis in particular is that it's a form of dissociation, like you said. And it's usually parts of the person one group of parts are trying to convey something, and another group of parts are really afraid to know whatever that thing is. And we all have that. I've never been psychotic, but I have that. My parts don't want to know things sometimes. So my work with a person is really about finding enough relational safety that as they're telling me things, because essentially what looks like psychosis is just coded language. If I'm the psychotic person, when I start to feel afraid of you, Tim, I won't be direct with you and say, I feel afraid, because if I'm afraid, that makes me vulnerable and you might hurt me. And I'm not going to push you away because you might come after me. Or I'm not going to do anything that's offensive, for instance. This is an example, right? So what I might do instead is I might give you some form of metaphoric languaging or communication that invites you to hear what's going on for me without me trying to make myself vulnerable. That's the attempt of the protector anyway. So I had a client who, when I was asking some questions, they were feeling intrusive to him. But instead of saying to me, your questions are way too intrusive, he said to me, well, I had asked him, what does that part inside of you say to you about that thing? And he said to me, Sherlock Holmes. And I thought, what does that mean? And I was remembering that previously, because he's a very polite person, he had said to me, oh, I'm really enjoying your relentless curiosity. And in the time he said it, I thought, that's an odd way to say it, relentless curiosity. It doesn't sound like he's enjoying it at all. But he's so polite, right? So again, even that's coded. There's a little coded message in giving me a compliment when he doesn't really mean it, when he's trying to convey. And then this session later, when he kind of says Sherlock Holmes to me, when he actually listens inside, not blended with a polite manager, right? And I said to him, who's Sherlock Holmes, you or me? And he said, you are. And I went, ah. And I said to him, well, am I questions too much or too pointy? That's right. I said, are they too pointy? And he said, yes. And I said, okay, let's let that go for a little while. So the main thing about working with people with psychosis is about relational safety. And when the client gives you a message through basically bringing in a moment that one of my colleagues, Matt Ball, years ago coined dissociotic. It looks psychotic, but it's actually a form of dissociation. When the client goes like, you're just talking about something benign, and out of nowhere they just start saying something that you're like, what? Where did that come from? And that's the quote unquote psychosis, right? Then it's a moment to slow down and go, what just happened? Something didn't feel safe, and that's the only reason the psychosis came in. And that happens throughout all of the sessions. So really my whole goal is to slow down enough to sort of calibrate to moving away from what parts do want to go to. Some parts want to go to those things. Other parts find it difficult. So I'm not pushing an agenda. The client's literally telling me something super important to them, and then another part freaks out, and that's when the dissociotic moment comes in.
Okay, between those two.
Yes. So it's not, this is my way of working. And so what I was going to say is I know people in the hearing voices movement, because I was involved with that movement for a long time, who do grounding techniques and all different ways of working with people. I just don't do any of that. I'm much more interested in being in relationship with the client. And so the other way that I work is a lot of mentalization.
Okay. Tell me more about
So a
that.
lot of trying to, sorry?
Tell me, you said mentalization?
Yes. So mentalization is, it's basically a way of thinking about my own thoughts and feelings and beliefs, and a way of thinking about, or it's not a way of, it's thinking about my own feelings, thoughts, and beliefs. And it's imagining your feelings, thoughts, or beliefs. And usually people who are having experiences of psychosis have had to cut off from that because they haven't felt safe. Feeling your own feelings is not safe. Knowing how you actually think or feel, not safe often. And so what I'm doing is a lot of times I'm guessing so for instance, another one of my clients would have these things happen with his mum, and I'd go, I wonder what might be going on inside of your mum at that moment. And for me, what I'm trying to get to is he's made a story, it's because he's a bad kid, he's a teenager, and I'm saying, maybe your mum's anxious. And those little moments of starting to mentalize her, noticing his own feelings, help to kind of pull out of the psychosis, right? Because everything about psychosis is about shame, in my opinion.
Yeah,
The
and
cold wound of shame, and yeah.
not to minimize, I mean, that there are extreme situations, like you said, the DSM, which I'm not familiar with at all. But when I talk with my wife again, she had mentioned things like, bipolar 1, bipolar 2, schizophrenia, and we try to get away from that labeling. But I think of my own life and just the shame and trauma of neglect that I've had. And when I meet to have a practitioner, I think I'm tracking with you here. If I'm not, let me know. But to have someone reflect, like, give me options of what's going
Yes.
on, it helps me to, because I don't know. And it sounds like that it's similar in some ways to, I mean, I hope it makes
Yes, and
folks
that's
that
probably,
it normalizes it, and we need people like you too. Yeah.
yeah, and I think that that's where it probably does deviate from IFS a little bit. So, most of I see clients who are therapists, I see clients who are coming to me from for other kinds of trauma, and I might not need to do any mentalization with them. But people with psychosis in particular, I'm going to be doing quite a lot of parts work, language, as well as being the self to the system in their system for a while. So I'm the self, and
Yes.
I'm doing the clarity and the connection and the compassion.
Yeah, that makes sense, and it's very helpful with that. And I'm curious, tell me a little more about transference, projection, how that has come
Yes.
into your practice, and yeah,
Okay.
just tell me more about
So
that.
I will just say to you too, can I just go backtrack though? You said something about bipolar. And yeah, so I will also work with people with bipolar, and there's it's such an I'm very lucky to work with a woman who's a IFS therapist with a diagnosis of bipolar, and she's letting me record our sessions to put into a book, because there's these main themes with someone who has psychosis, with someone who has bipolar. Um, there's these kind of like themes around something wanting to be known and something being afraid to be known. And there's times in the session where I know what's going on and she doesn't. And so, and her thinking parts come in and go, what? And I'm like, it's okay. It's okay. We don't have to work it out. This is slowly coming up, and there's no rush. When your parts are ready, you'll get everything. And there are times when she says to me, like, I'm so glad you know what's going on, Stephanie, because it doesn't always make complete sense. But I'm sitting back going, makes a lot of sense to me. So I think that bipolar in particular, not only does it follow the same themes of fear of knowing something very painful, very, very painful, but also one of the big protectors is create like mania, right? Keep above that pain by this energy. And then, of course, when you burn out from that, or that doesn't work enough and you still get triggered, then you fall into the kind of hopeless despair. And so you're needing, when I work with bipolar clients, I'm needing to befriend both parts, both the very manic part who's trying desperately to keep away and the really hopeless, depressed part, so that hopefully we can get to the exiles.
And does that show up? And I guess depending, I mean, it shows up like the manic part could be in. I mean, they could both be in session, I guess, but the manic could be one time, and then the next session could it be the more down and depressed, or how does that work?
Yeah, it can be. Most of the time, people who are coming to see me have some medication on board, and so I'm not seeing a lot of people in mania. Um, Usually, people who can afford to come to see me and have the privilege of like knowing about IFS and all the other layers of that are coming with they're ready to do some work. But as far as enough stability, I have had some people who've in the past, when I worked in services and not in private practice, who vacillated through the highs and the lows. And it's very, very hard for someone in a mania or the terrified experience of the depression, because it's really frightening. Um, Especially the mania is very hard because it feels too good, right?
Right.
Um, so it's very hard to do much other than hold space and really invite them to think about if you try and say, is this the best choice right now, they're not going to have any perspective. This protector is so good, It's when they kind of come down from that they're like, okay, what am I going to do next time that needs to be different? And then that's when you're going to be working with the exiles. Yeah.
When they've come down.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And you can keep kind of, this is your expertise, so keep intertwining other things that need to be said, but the transference and the projection. And so is that on to you, on to other, like, tell me more about that.
Well, so the thing about transference is it's everywhere, Tim. We're always, every single relationship we have, we're hoping to have a corrective experience from our childhood, right? When we partner with someone, we're really hoping that the missing experiences we didn't have around love or connection or attachment or feeling good enough or seen, they're the needs that we have as little children that often we didn't get met. And when we partner, we're really hoping our partner will do that. Well, that's transference right there, right? You are my mother, and I really need you to tell me I'm valid, tell me I'm lovable, tell me I'm good, see me, hear me, hold me, right? And so not all of that is transference, obviously. Some of it is just we're wired for connection as human beings. So some of our need for touch is because we're mammals and because that's just kind of like intrinsic to who we are. But some of it is transference. What's the important thing around transference in the therapy room is when a client uses transference as part of their healing. And that's what I'm really interested in. And so I haven't personally found that there's a lot of overt transference going on with psychotic clients, not yet anyway. There occasionally are bits and pieces of idealization and things like that, but the people that have the most transference are often people with really, I don't know what the word is for it, just the kind of attachment wounding where they didn't have a steady attachment figure. And so maybe disorganized attachment is a way of, I don't love that term either, but basically what transference, so projection is where I take my feelings and how I perceive myself and the world and I project them onto you, Tim. So when if you said something to me and I felt a feeling of maybe not feeling very good or rejected or hurt or confused, I might project onto you, Tim was mean to me, or Tim rejected me, or Tim doesn't like me. And so what I'm interested in when I'm working with clients with trauma is how do we use that for healing? And so the types of transference I'm interested in are sexual transference, where the client projects something in the therapeutic relationship around sexuality and sex. And I've had clients who want to have sex with me, and we talk about it. It's really important, actually. So not just attraction, but actually like I want to have sex with you, like, and okay, well, let's find out what would it mean for you if you could have sex with me. And what we hear is, this one client who said that to me said, you know me more intimately than any other person in the planet. And if you could still love me and value me and find me there was actually a desirable as a human being, right, during sex, then that would kind of like cancel out all my trauma. And so I was like, well, I get that that's a belief of a protector. I'm pretty sure it wouldn't work like that. I'm pretty sure even if we did have sex, which we're not going to do because, so many reasons, professional boundaries being one of them, right? But even if we did, I'm pretty sure that wouldn't actually resolve your trauma. And so for me, using the transference for the healing is really important. Don't be afraid of it. And that client was a client of mine who heard voices. And that client said to me, when I said I wasn't going to have sex with him, he had a voice saying rape, rape, rape over and over, right? And what's really important is that I'm not afraid of that. People have all these ideas about what schizophrenia means, what psychosis means, all of this kind of like hoo-ha that's in the media. All that it means is a part, when I spent some time getting to know, it's a part who felt humiliated, a part who, like, if you think about the most humiliating thing that you can imagine, what do you want to do? You want to get the upper hand again, don't you? I don't want to be vulnerable when I'm humiliated. I want to retaliate. I want to say, I'm angry at you, or I'm going to take what I wanted. The little kid who says, Mummy says, you can't have a lolly, and then they sneak in and they take it, right? Whatever that is. So it's young. And so for me, I think especially as IFS practitioners or therapists, we have to be in our self-energy and be curious.
And I love, that example I get now of how you use the transference or projection for healing. Am I using those right? They can both kind of.
Yes. And I probably didn't explain the extra piece, right? Because what I didn't explain to you was I said about how we tracked that it's about him feeling worthless and not desirable. And the next question, after we got through the piece about, our relationship, the next question is, how long have you felt like you're not desirable? And so that's where we're using it to go to the trailhead, right?
Got it. And how do you, and as practitioners, having the confidence and that self energy to go right into that, like how has this work affected you? How are you so confident in a situation like that? What feedback for
Yeah.
someone who is more of a newbie? I mean, I've been at this 4 years or so. I would love some insight with that, how you do that and how it has
Yeah.
affected you, if it has.
Yeah. Well, I'm lucky. One of my very first supervisors was psychodynamically trained. And in psychodynamic stuff, there's space for all of those kinds of projections and using the transference. So I had some really good supervision. So if you have a client who's using projection, whether it's sexual, whether it's maternal, I want you to be my mother, or paternal, I want you to be my father, that literally a child saying, you are my attachment figure. I don't want self-energy. I want you. So all of that's welcome in psychodynamic. So you can get a really good supervisor who will help you through that process. And IFS doesn't talk enough about it, in my opinion, because there's so much focus on self-energy. But when you've got people who have really early, my part, so this is another thing that's probably important to mention, is one of the reasons that I find it so easy is I have my own intensity. I have a lot of, my trauma has showed up with a lot of dysregulation. So when I sit next to somebody, in front of somebody who's really dysregulated, I'm like, I know what that's like, and I know you're going to survive it, and I am not worried about it. I had a woman self-harm in session. She cut her arm open with a nail file. And I was just like, okay, well, what happened there? Just talk about it. Because it's not my job to stop her doing that, right? It's only a protector, and it did it for a reason, and we can find out. And so, it's not my job to jump out and down and make a big scene out of something. It's like, I care and accept you no matter what. And let's find out what happened just then, because there's meaning behind it. So that's one of the reasons I've been quite good. It's good supervision. I have my own intensity, so I'm not afraid of other people's intensity. I grew up with a lot of domestic violence, so I'm used to a lot of chaos, right? And anger in my family, love. The interesting thing that I didn't think I really explained just a minute ago, I started to, and then I stopped. I've had my own transference in therapy as the client. So as the client, I've had a lot of transference with my IFS practitioner, because my young parts say, I have always taken care of myself, and I have always loved, and I actually have a young part in me called Kind One. Her actual full name is the Nurturing Womb of Kindness, which was dubbed by one of my friends. But she would, as a child, at night in bed, stroke my back and let me know it's all going to be okay, and that I wasn't bad, even though I was told I was bad. So she had a really big role in my life as a child. So, of course, when I came to IFS, my parts were like, nah, this self-energy is rubbish. We've been doing that all of our lives. And of course, my past didn't know self is completely different to a manager, right? But it took a long time. So there's partly that's another reason why I can do that. But there's another thing too that I was going to say. Oh, just, yeah, for me, my wounding is so particular to, and there's a subgroup of people who've had wounding where actually taking in love and care is the most terrifying thing. Anger, not a problem. I've interjected in fights on the street, right? I've literally two teenage boys beating up on each other, and I'm like, that's not going to happen, right? Because for my family of origin, was in the midst of that all the time, and I know that if you're loud enough, you can shut it down. But loving and connection, absolutely terrifying. So my parts used to say to my IFS practitioner all the time, being in relationship with you is the most terrifying thing I have ever done, because she loved me. So that's probably one of the other reasons that it's easier for me. I've done enough of my healing to have gone through all of that.
What's helpful too, and there's a place, I know with IFS, we don't have an agenda. We're self-led. We're kind of tracking with the client, but there is a place to kind of challenge or to probe and to be able to soften back if we're missing the mark. But that's a balance too that we have to learn, and having that lived experience and our own trauma. Yeah, that's gifts that.
Yeah. And there's some great books too. Like if you want to read, if your listeners want to read some good books, oh my gosh, probably the best book on early developmental trauma, apart from the Understanding and Treating Chronic Shame, is a book by Dan Hughes, which talks about disorganized attachment. It's called Building the Bonds of Attachment, Awakening Love in the Deeply Traumatized Child, or Children, sorry. And you can put it in your show notes. And then the other one, if you want a book on psychosis, the best one I think is I'm such a mess that these things are always on my desk. Psychosis, Trauma, and Dissociation is the best book. It outlines the attachment wounding pieces around psychosis.
Well, yeah, thanks for those resources. And yeah, I'll put those in the show notes for folks so that they can find them. Well, let's see. Yeah, I'll begin to wrap up. Wow, we could just keep talking. It's intriguing. So what do you hope to see in the future with IFS, especially in relation to supporting clients with, and I hesitate to even term it, like severe mental illness challenges like psychosis is what I have here. Kind of push back on that. Tell us how to frame it. And what do you hope with that? Yeah.
Yeah. In the mental health, so there's a whole group called the psychiatric survivors movement. And they basically like to call these experiences non-ordinary states. Voices, visions, and non-ordinary states is often a way that you'll see it framed. Unfortunately, the psychedelic movement has taken over the label of non-ordinary states, which is a bit sad in a way, because then it gets confusing about if I'm turning up saying I'm doing a talk on non-ordinary states, people are like, what are you talking about? Psychedelics or something else? So, but yeah, so these experiences, what I would love to see happen is you don't have to be a clinician to work with psychosis. I'm actually supervising a man at the moment who's a coach. And I know in the US, you guys have some weird rules. We don't have the same rules in Australia. So this is an Australian coach. And he provides, we have a funding pool, a government funding pool called the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And it basically allows a client comes in and they get assessed for their need, and then they get allotted a certain amount of money for various therapies, and the client has a choice about where they spend that. And so this particular person does equine therapy and coaching, and he came to my IFS immersion training, and he is doing some work with a man who hears voices and has visual hallucinations, and the work he's doing is incredible. This guy feels safe for the first time in his life in a relationship. And I keep saying to this supervisee, which I'll call John, I keep saying to John, you're a natural, right? You know how to be because you have self-energy and you have curiosity. And so for me, I think that working with people who have voices or visions is pretty easy if we get over the parts of ourselves that think we have to fix anything.
Yeah, and someday, and you're right.
So I
And
think
yeah, go ahead, Stephanie.
I was just going to say, I think that that's one of my passions is that there's two big things, or maybe three, that I want for the IFS community. I want more talk about the self of the therapist being there for the client, because it's been very important in my personal healing. If my my IFS practitioner was trying to push me to be in self as as much as some other people have, I wouldn't have stayed, to be honest. I needed her being the self to my system for a period of time to have a corrective experience so my parts could trust myself. And also, to be honest, the enactment piece is what we call it. When someone does a projection, when someone uses a transference to heal, we call it kind of an enactment. What would happen was I would see something in my IFS practitioner that reminded me of my mum that was too painful to be with. So I'd almost imagine she was doing that thing. So I was enacting something old, but I would catch myself doing it. And then I would get a memory that related to that. So we use the transference all the time to take us to the past. It was a very powerful way of working. And the amount of healing that I've been able to do using her self energy as the self to my system at times before there's enough to have my self energy, has allowed me to almost like the embodied sense of my self energy is different than in the past when I've tried to be in self.
Yes, that, and it's been, I mean, I have noticed too, even in my own work, is people, even people who are trained in the mental health world, they've come to me and they say, but they're just a stigma. And this is, we need it all. And there's nothing against any of it. I'm so grateful that, first of all, that I got into a training when there were therapists and everyone in the same boat, because it's been some beautiful connections there. And I've met with therapists who agree, like sometimes the stigma, like people will come to me and who knows, maybe that's a gateway to a therapist. I'm not opposed to that at all, but I just love how IFS is open as much as possible to, yeah, the creativity, working together, and just a beautiful healing happening in this work. And I'm just so grateful and honored to, yeah, to have a conversation with someone like you. And so I appreciate your time. And I'm going to ask you in a bit kind of how people can find you, what you want to get out to listeners. I've seen some great things that you're doing on Facebook and whatnot. But before I do that, yeah, what have I missed? What else? Or anything else that
I
you would
think I
like to
wasn't
say?
succinct enough. Just at the end, I think the three things that I really want to bring to the IFS community are focus on the relational aspects of IFS and the therapist being the self to the system for early developmental trauma, that anyone can work with psychosis if you have good supervision and you work on your own parts, right? Because you have to help your own parts who have burdens. Um, and I thought I had a third thing, but I think that might just be the main two. Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's beautiful and it's an encouragement to me. And yeah, I've seen that in my own work. And yeah, and I know Dick Schwartz says, yeah, if the practitioner or therapist, coach, if you can just stay in self energy, that's all that matters. And that's a big ask. But the more you practice and do this, you can feel it. And it's just right. And I love it. So, yes, thank you so much. Well, tell us, yeah, how can people find you? What do you got going on? Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, just to
Okay.
get out
well,
so if people have other
I'm
questions.
starting research on IFS and psychosis in September, supposedly, which is only a few days away, with the University of California, San Francisco, and a partnership with Flinders University in Australia. So we're in the baby stages of setting that up. I'm also offering some trainings. One that actually starts this weekend. I do an IFS immersion for people wanting to gain skills in more nuanced approaches to IFS. And then I teach one on early developmental trauma for people who are already trained in IFS. So if people have IFS training and they want to learn more about how to work with clients who use projection, clients who are really dysregulated, clients who have trouble going inside, clients who bounce from part to part to part in a session, or so I kind of have some nice ways of it's a 7-week course, but we have 2 weeks in between because there's a fair bit of reading and extra videos and things. So that's another course that I run.
And what's your website?
People can just find me. My website is stephaniemitchell.com.au.
Stephanie, thanks so much for reaching out, for your time, and for working with me on doing this interview. And I look forward to this being the first of others in the future, for sure. But so great to cross paths and to meet you. Yeah.
Yeah, you too, Tim.
All right.
Thanks very much for the opportunity.
That wraps up another episode of IFS Meditations and Insights. If you found it useful, please follow or subscribe and share, and leave a positive review to help others find the podcast. For more IFS Meditations and Insights, visit blog.faithfullygrowing.com. As always, your thoughts on the podcast are welcome. Send me an email to tim@faithfullygrowing.com. And thank you for being part of our community. Remember to be compassionate to yourself and others. And I look forward to our next session. And until then, take care, stay curious, and embrace all parts of your journey.